Welcome everybody back from our little break. Up next, we have Brandt Stickley, Rewilding Chinese Medicine. With looming collapse, geopolitical intrigue, and climate impacts, what is the future of Chinese medicine in our region? And what does rewilding look like? By tracing the fascinating story of a historical herbal text, most recently transmitted via memorization, we will uncover a Daoist model of local, bioregional herbal medicine that conforms to the cosmology and physiology of classical Chinese medicine, communicates respectfully with local indigenous herb lore, and flourishes locally in communication with the plants and the land. Brandt Stickley is an acupuncturist and Chinese medicine teacher specializing in Chinese medicine, anti-psychiatry. Thank you, Brandt, for joining us at the 7th Annual Rewilding Conference.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's been a long time coming. Part of the reason I wanted to come out here was because y'all were out here in 2009. And we've done some language hunting, and we've done some immediate moment issues and all those things. And it's a real pleasure and feels like a kind of special thing to me to be presenting today. And this is if we think about, if I tell you about classical Chinese medicine, anti-psychiatry, that's like a niche within a niche within a niche. And so the good news is that that niche is about life, and it's about attending to life, and it's about always attending to and supporting and encouraging life as an ongoing interaction between an endlessly creative, constantly emerging reality in conjunction with, that we call heaven in Chinese medicine, in conjunction with having one's ear and one's body so close to the earth that they become the means by which heaven and earth communicate. And there have been, through the years, so many ways in which I have found Chinese medicine basic principles so consistent with what I understand the meaning of rewilding to be, that I view it as a vehicle for that work. I view it as a means to help people make the change of mindset and way of thinking that will hopefully usher in a greater understanding and a greater practice of rewilding. So do I have, I'll need to be able to share the screen. Okay. So what follows is a long and convoluted tale, and it emerges out of what I truly know, and where I've gathered the majority of my experience practicing Chinese medicine over the last 25 years now. And it opens into something that's more interesting to me, and that is what I don't know. And it's an attempt to think through a problem, to see a solution emerge, to allow a solution to emerge, and to envision from within a framework out of which my experience rises. And so that is to say, we have this body of classical literature. Interestingly, that literature, if we attend most closely to its very first iterations, seems to move more fluidly through time, so that it has one eye very clearly in a pre-literate oral culture, and also expresses itself through those texts forward into the future. And so we have this window through those texts, those Han Warring States and Han Dynasty texts. So we're talking about, 200 on either side of the 200 years on either side of the Common Era, and those texts seem to admit of a worldview that is deeply, as I will hope to show you, deeply animist and an expression of a relational ontology. And from that, we should be able to look at any style of herbalism and understand it more fully through that lens. So I'll open up the slides now. So I always have an extraordinary amount of anxiety speaking, in spite of the fact that that's how I make my living, pretty much. And that anxiety is really based around my total inability to comprehend linear time. And so what happens is that I have this incredible fear that I'm going to go through all my slides in the next 10 minutes, and then I will be struck dumb and unable to speak. And so I've been playing that out for a few days. And then on the other hand, what might happen is that I will keep going at a fever's pitch, and there'll be no time for questions. So my goal today is to finish and have enough time for questions. So this is a very, very early text, and it is a text which was carved in a jade handle, which some believe may have been a walking stick handle. And it's known as the jade inscription on the circulation of the breath. And as such, it represents the oldest, within the Chinese cultural sphere, the oldest written description of meditation on the breath. And it was carved into a 12-sided piece of jade. And so I'd like you to imagine, as you listen or read this, I'd like you to imagine that you are following your breath as it expresses, as it explains. So to circulate the breath, swallow it so that it will accumulate. As it goes down, as it accumulates, it will expand. As it expands, it will descend. As it descends, it will stabilize. As it goes down to your root, down to around your navel, below your navel, it will stabilizes. And as it stabilizes, it will consolidate. As it consolidates, it will sprout. As it sprouts, it will grow. As it grows, it will reach its apex. And at the moment that it reaches the apex, it will return. As it returns, it merges with heaven. The heavenly impulses, however, are revealed in the rising of qi. The earthly impulses are revealed in the descending of qi. Go along with this and you will live. Go against it and you will die. That is to say that the quality of our life is in large measure emerging from this void, cycling through multiple different expansions and contractions of cyclical time, and will eventually return to begin anew. Every morning, every night at midnight, it opens, dawn arises, noon arrives, dusk arrives, the sun descends, the sun goes back under the earth. This cycle, this diurnal cycle continues every day. 2-week cycles. The seasons unfold in 2-week cycles in exactly the same manner. Those 2-week cycles unfold into seasons in exactly the same manner. Those seasons manifest as years in exactly the same manner, and so on and so on. As we localize this in the body, we get to this description from a classical text that's called the Suwen, the Simple Questions. That's part of the Neijing, the inner canon, the Huangdi Neijing Suwen, chapter 39, which is called the chapter on pain. And interestingly, in the middle of that chapter that describes all of the ways in which a person can start to experience pain and why, recognizing that the body is capable of producing only a limited number of symptoms, but that the causes of those symptoms are unlimited and almost infinite. The body's responsiveness occurs through movement. And that movement, as that courses through our body, in the same way that the breath follows a pattern that courses through our body, will have particular movements that express emotion. So in the middle of this pattern, this description of how people experience pain, we see this very clear description of emotion as direction. So as you probably experienced, when one is angry, the chi rises. And when one is joyous, the chi relaxes. When one is sad, the chi dissipates. When one is in fear, the chi moves down. In the case of cold, it collects. And in the case of heat, it expands and goes out. When one is frightened, which is to say that when one reacts to an experience of fear, so when one is in fear, the chi moves down, and the body will often adopt a protective posture. But when one is frightened, one is as if startled and mobilizes the channels in the back and experiences a kind of sudden uprushing that is called disorder, and can actually mean a disorder that can be so profound that it's as if the forces that hold and consolidate cannot hold on to the rest of the energy, and it moves up wildly. And when one is exhausted, the chi is wasted because it's bound up and can't move. Like when one is pensive, the chi lumps together. And all of one's thoughts could be focused on one thing, and we would refer to that as the chi lumping together. So this is exactly a description of movement that follows that precise cycle. But we can't only think of that cycle as a circle. In fact, we can't even think of it as bounded in any way, because it's a circle whose circumference is the cosmos. And within that, we emerge constantly from that void. We're constantly being born anew. And that cycle is happening at multiple different rates. Our body is constantly responding to changes in the environment, which is likened to a cycle that moves 25 times per day and 25 times per night. At the same time, there are aspects of our physiology which express themselves through diurnal cycles. In other words, every 2 hours, there's appropriate aspects of the activities of daily living and appropriate aspects of metabolism that are happening, and those unfold in this diurnal cycle, which is quite regular, which is half conceived as half the amount of time, half of the cycles that happen in response to the environment. And at the same time that you're sitting here digesting your lunch and digesting all of the amazing talks that we've heard in the last, since yesterday, you are also living out some aspect that began at the very beginning, at the very first breath that you have, and is going to unfold only in cycles of 7 or 8 years until you mature and decline and die. And you're living all of those temporal realities simultaneously. And there are aspects of your physiology in Chinese medicine that respond to each one of those dynamics. So this is what follows here are a number of passages from the anthropologist Tim Ingold, and really one of the great students of relational ontology and animic ontology. So he says in one of his major papers that life in the animic ontology, in the animist way of knowing, is not an emanation but a generation of being in a world that is not preordained but incipient. Incipient is a very, very important word in Chinese medicine, because the word that means incipient is cognate and almost the exact same character with the word that means trigger and the word that means mechanism. And so incipient is something always on the verge of emerging into being. And it's always on the verge of, and there's an understanding that emerges constantly in relationship to something else. That everything exists in a context of a series of nested and embedded relationships. So one is continually present as witness to that moment, always moving like the crest of a wave at which the world is about to disclose itself for what it is. So that what it is a series, is as I said, a nested group of centers and peripheries, constantly in motion, constantly emerging, constantly taking expression. So he says that we should imagine the organism then not as a self-contained object like a ball or like a circle only that can propel itself from place to place, but as an ever ramifying web of lines and growth. The philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari famously likened this web to a rhizome, though Ingold and I both prefer the image of the fungal mycelium. Whatever metaphor we choose, the organism now looks something like this that you see on the left. It goes without saying this depiction would do just as well for persons who, being organisms, likewise extend along multiple pathways of their involvement with the world. So imagine that networked mycelial quality as actually four-dimensional, at least three-dimensional, and probably four-dimensional, moving out in all directions. So the fact is that in keeping with all of those other cycles of time, there are cycles of time outside of us that we call ancestors, and there are cycles outside of us that we call descendants, and there are cycles within us that relate to our ancestors in their interactions with other ancestors, and our descendants as making the future world. And these are all accessible and legible to Chinese medicine through the system of channels. All of those aspects are actually, as I like to say, everything materializes, but not everything is a thing. Everything, every aspect of time, although not simply an object, manifests into some degree of materiality as it intersects with human bodies and with the earth. And our body is itself a manifestation of the earth. It is the earth. It is not as if our body is like the earth. Our body is earth. So if we look at this taking all that we've taken in, we can look at this diagram right here, which I mentioned. I make my living teaching, and I would say that the majority of what I teach is how to understand this diagram. So we can overlay, in as much as our bodies are the earth. We occupy this line here, and this center within this diagram, and within that we can observe the light, the sun arising in the east, and it is conceived as reaching its apex in the south, descending therefore in the west, and returning back into the void from whence it came in the north. Now that will perfectly describe the winter solstice at the nadir, the vernal equinox, the summer solstice, the autumnal equinox, all appearing with those 4 seasons around this circle. When we go to the level of 5, we bring in a system of organization of those movements around a pole. On the right of this, you see listed down in number the Chinese words for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Note that 8 is within 4. And note that these simple 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines are literally 1, 2, 3, but they represent something unified, something separating, something coming back towards the center around a central pivot, then going to all the directions with the number 4, coming back to a center with 5, and you can see how the character 5 with the asterisk next to it here is this very orderly expression of what that means to have the 4 arranged around a center. And that's to say that in the center, our humanity is present, observing all of these movements, these grand and minor movements all around us. And then we introduce 6. And as we introduce 6, we're actually looking at a depiction of a human being with their arms outstretched, taking in the energy of heaven and moving it through their bodies, cycling it, channeling it through their bodies to connect to the earth. So 6 is a person standing like this. 7 is another number of emergence. As you can see, that represents something coming up above the ground, emerging from the ground like a sprout. And then 8 recapitulates directionality with all of the directions. So arranged around this, in keeping with, you can imagine the movement of here is anger rising on this side, and here's the descending into the earth on this side. Here's the heavenly movement from here, from the bottom all the way to the top was described as the heavenly movement. The earthly impulse is the imminent movement inward. And we can arrange all of the organs and situate all of the yin holding, spirit holding organs within the body around this cycle. And so all of those aspects are depicted here, along with the names of the channels that are associated with them and those areas. So the bottom line is, there's only one source of symptoms in all of Chinese medicine, and that's flowing against that flow of those cycles, which is the flow of the numinous meaning it is the movement of spiritual reality through our physical reality. Often allopathic or conventional approaches oppose this movement, right? So death is not contrary to the movement of life. Death is an expression of life. Just like you wouldn't say midnight is contrary to life, or midnight is contrary or not part of the day, neither is death. So these herbal formulas that we're going to discuss a little bit, they express a way to engage with the establishment of flow back into a balanced and harmonious relationship with movement through those cycles. Whichever one of the cycles is disrupted or is out of time can be brought back into coherence and resonance with time. So that's to say that they promote the resonance of the conformation of the movement that they're expressing with its natural physiological state, and in so doing are recreating the emergent world constantly anew. As we take in this miracle of taking in plant substances into our body and transforming them first into impulse and energy and essence, and then into the physicality of our body, we are indeed making a new world within a world that also is alive, animated, and equally embodied according to the exact same set of parameters that our very life is. So if we think about that in the context of Chinese medicine channels, we could say that a relational ontology, a presence within a set of nested relationships that animate us, is embodied in the myriad pathways of animation, which are a way to describe the channel systems that are traditionally understood in Chinese medicine. And they have qualities of pivoting into being fully expressed, and then closing down. So we have pivoting, opening, and closing, both in yin and yang, in energy and in substance. That is the very energetic structure that constitutes the body in Chinese medicine, comprised of both form and function, matter and energy, is also rhizomic in its intricacy, autopoetic, sympoetic in its manifestation. And within the pathways, the junctions of these pathways, we see the relational rhizomic unfolding of consciousness itself. The channel system, the patterns of organization upon which they are modeled, is an example of the three-dimensional incarnation of consciousness, or the activity of the numinous, and of animation as it is in the world in which this animation unfolds. That is to say that when we're looking at the classical texts that I was describing, these are texts which are texts about physiology, which are modeled on not only how the cosmos is conceived to be constantly renewing itself, but how life itself is constantly renewing itself, and is an expression of how consciousness itself unfolds along all of those pathways of contact with the world as it is in relationship to it. So that when we read those texts, they are expressions in unique ways, expressions of this dynamic, emergent, relational view. Now, back to this cycle, we can posit along this that for you, if you're experiencing anger, that's also a way of you saying no to something that you don't want. And that's a rising up, as in how our blood has to circulate against the force of gravity to rise up to the top of our head to nourish our brain, for example. As that emerges into life in above that line, it harmonizes with activities of daily living and all the actions of metabolism. As it reaches its peak, at its peak, we can describe our relationality itself as awareness, love, communication, creativity, artistry, in order to make room for those experiences at the level of the mind to come into the body, we have to have a descending quality that we call metal, which makes space, for those new things, but also makes contact with those new things. So just as you take in a breath and you let go of what you no longer need, these are inward, downward movements that we call metal. For an example of that, you have this lung and large intestine action of rites of passage, through which you gain a different experience of your being, your individuality, and your autonomy as you move through change. And ultimately, that the greatest expression of that change is coming into right relationship with everything that is, which we could describe as a return to the water, or a return to the bare quality of being that takes its expression through you. So all of those aspects of life are present on this, and there's nothing in life that can't be understood in terms of one of those factors. In fact, just for fun, I pulled the Rewild Portland values off the website and have now arranged those on this to show you that your well-being, the quality of your being, would be in water. The emergence of your agency, which is to say that you have the self-direction to decide how you're going to express yourself, is in wood. Accessibility is that harmonization of metabolism. Belonging is the communication through which we establish community. Authenticity is how we take that burgeoning sense of self and make it actually a genuine part of us so that we can share that with others. And so in doing so, we build community through stewardship, through nurturing and fostering our relationships that we make authentically by belonging through accessibility as an expression of our agency that promotes our wellness. So even that, and of course, you could track this all the way through every concentric circle of civic society and so on. And the root of it is mutual aid, support, relationality. Okay, now we get into the brass tacks. So this shows a description of how taste that we take into our mouths and that our body extracts essence and impulse from all have very specific actions. So this is a system, which is what we'll be exploring in a few minutes, that describes a set of 25 herbs, each of which occupies an appropriate place and action within each sphere. So you have, in other words, 5 phases within 5 phases. And these are all well-known Chinese herbs, which comprise a number of the major herbs that are used in the Shanghan Lun, which is the herbal tradition that I practice. So in a basic way, we could say spicy flavor mimics this outward movement. Sour mimics the lung. Sweet is the relaxation of joy, and that happens within the earth. Bitter consolidates and descends, and salty softens and like we saw perhaps a week ago with the ice, melts the ice and melts the obstacles. So that model was articulated in a text was known as the Fuxing Jue, the hidden practices, the discussion of hidden practices. And this was purported to be part of a very ancient text that was that was purportedly called the Tongye Jing, but for which there's no evidence. So this, the Fuxing Jue is purported to be a text written by a Daoist hermit and polymath named Tao Hong Jing, one of the most important figures in Taoism, living in the 5th century. And supposedly his work maintains a more ancient work. This text was supposed to have been buried in what are called the Dunhuang caves, which was guarded by a monk and then sold to a Chinese doctor. And then the text itself was supposedly sold to a Chinese doctor at a time when Western researchers like this Frenchman right here and Aurel Stein in England were taking away each 10,000 hidden manuscripts that were secured in these caves, literally hundreds, like literally 1,000 years ago. So within that context, one herbal text was saved from that imperialistic repossession or possession, and supposedly was given to a doctor who then cherished that text, which is now what we call the Fuxing Jue, as a family heirloom, and passed it down to his son or his grandson. His name was Zhang Dachong. This book here is his book, his case studies and theory, and he was purported to be an expert physician. But he held on to that text, and during the Cultural Revolution claims that the physical manuscript was lost. So he submitted the manuscript from his memory to his students and to the government to preserve it. So the only evidence we have for this text is the memorized, preserved recital of it from this practitioner, who was nevertheless purportedly a great physician. So that great mystery is described in this book by historian Sabine Wilms. Celestial Secrets is the name of it. And in spite of that history, the Fuxing Jue text has been included in anthologies of medieval texts by Chinese historians. So what we see is that, like, this question of authorship, which is so important in some contexts, is not so important in historical Chinese contexts. And so work is often attributed to a great ancestor, a great progenitor in a field, without concern for authorship. So what we do know is that this text probably came from the Song dynasty, and not from 2,000 years ago, but from maybe 1,000 years ago. And you can do this through a philological research. So what we know of it is that, yes, indeed, it was a Daoist herbal manual, and it was a Daoist herbal manual that contained a text of formulas, and that the organization of it and the organization of the herbs into that 25 herb mandala was really a mnemonic device that was meant to help hermit Daoist monks to stay healthy when they went into the mountains. And so that is to say, it is really more than anything itself a mnemonic device. And it's not a closed circle either. It's a spiral, because within that arrangement of the herbs, there are straight errors, such as this herb Dahuang is not salty, although it is placed in the position of salty. And this Shengdi Romania is not bitter, although it is considered to be the water of water and therefore bitter. So what does that mean? That means that if we understand these dynamics, we can apply this mnemonic model of 5 phases within 5 phases to any group, any materia medica. And so what that made me think was, given the state of the world, why not apply that to the Pacific Northwest? Here's a further articulation of how the herbs interact. Now we have multiple situations such as you see listed here, the bottom line of which is Chinese medicine, the Chinese government is pouring a ton of money and research into Chinese medicine, but it's becoming more technological. In the meantime, it's becoming a vast weapon, a vast expression of capitalism itself. And literally, it faces difficulties in reception in the West, where the very important herb mahuang, which contains ephedra, was banned. And although it was not banned for Chinese medicine practitioners, is still very hard to get. And included within that now are other herbs that are also very hard to get. So we can see that if Houthi rebels in dinghies can stop the supply chain, then Chinese medicine, this now worldwide impulse, also will be affected. And it's got multiple challenges. So in spite of the fact that the Chinese government is putting all this research and energy and effort into it, even to the point of furthering the medicine of minority groups in China, it's often going in the wrong direction. So that's another reason into a positivist scientific research direction, which is itself not ideal. So with those circumstances in place, I thought to myself, how can we apply this model of taste and direction to local Pacific Northwest herbs? And so here we have Huanglian, the Chinese herb, which is the fire of water, which therefore means that it is descending, cooling, and clearing toxic heat. And literally at the level of its constituents, it is the same as Oregon grape. In flavor, it is the same as Oregon grape. In action, it is the same as Oregon grape. In terroir, it is similar. And in function, it is virtually the same. So we can look at all of these correlations through multiple lenses. Another lens we can look through, of course, is the lens of our lived experience with the herbs. So while it's a little bit hard pressed to make a case that this herb, guager, cinnamon, and devil's club are related and that would both occupy the wood of wood position, my literal physical lived experience with it tells me that they are the same, that they are related. So in the classical expression of how we connect to herbs directly, that herb, guager, cinnamon, is said to treat counterflow cough with a scent of qi, bound qi, bee impediment in the throat, vomiting, retching, joint pain, supplements the center, boosts the qi, facilitates breakthrough of spiritual illumination, lightens the body, and staves off aging. Devil's Club has this respiratory effect. It is considered to be apotropaic, protective. It likewise physically strengthens the adrenals to counter the hypervigilance of those around those boundaries, which we could say is boosting the qi. It has been historically used to balance blood sugar, which is also boosting supplementing the center. And as Scott Close writes, helps us see the gift that gifts may arise from our wounds. And that's what we could call lightening the body or the emergence of spirit illumination. So those are just two examples. And here is my elaboration of what I believe to be herbal correlates from within the Pacific Northwest, that with a couple that could be cultivated, but mostly those that could be appropriately wildcrafted in a relational manner. And from this, we can use the same model to create Chinese herbal formulas that are consistent with this energetic framework without relying on import. So I've titled that this secret tips for effective treatment is a translation of Fu Xing Jue. So secret tips for effective treatment of the organs with Pacific Northwest medicinals. And this is very much a work in progress. And that means that every one of these single herbs will be further vetted across all of those different methodological parameters for comparison that I gave 2 examples of, and will become more firmly established. And that concludes my slideshow. It's a miracle. So any questions?
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I will read off questions as they appear in the chat. If you are in person and you'd like to ask a question, please come up here and we'll have you speak directly into my laptop. First question here from the chat is, I'm interested in how this interacts with the traditional 4 humors of early European medicine that only feel out of use about 150 to 200 years ago, except among some herbalists.
Yeah. Well, so again, it's like, as I said, I believe that if we understand this kind of if we directly perceive these qualities that I call gesture, that is to say the intersection of qualities of movement in the body with the physical body, then we can apply that to any framework, including that of humors. I'm personally most interested within this work that I'm sharing here today. I'm particularly interested in the 6 tissue states that Matthew Wood has written about, because that has pretty clear correlations that can be made to correlate pretty clearly with the 6 channels and their qualities. But as long as we strive to perceive the 4 humors in a gestural or energetic way, then we can understand it through the same lens. And that could inform also how we understand the herbs that are purported to work with that into this context.
Hi there. I'm Nick. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
Thank you for the hard work that you've been putting in. Just speaking in what capacity I might too, just from my folks are Pegan and Coast Salish, and there's a lot of remembered aspects that do seem to overlap with some of these understandings. I'd be really interested at a certain point of potentially getting together with you, and I don't want to speak for Bobby, but I'm assuming that there would also be some interest with Bobby and Jayshree, as far as discussions of definitely facilitating an ethos around it. Just because there's a couple of plants that I spotted on there that I'm concerned about ringing the dinner bell on, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would love to be able to help us to advocate for the populations of those plants to be in a position where we can more freely share in that medicine and so on. I'd like to invite some further conversation with a great deal of excitement and appreciation for the work that's gone in.
Yeah, and I would meet that also with great excitement and anticipation, because that's a very important issue for me. Insofar as I do not wish to be that man sitting in the cave with the manuscripts in any way, shape, or form. I expect to listen to the land and listen to the lore.
Thank you. One thing that I think is within my capacity to share if only because an elder has instructed me to share this information as widely as possible, especially for folks who are AFAB, is that Devil's Club has a capacity within the gifts that we receive from her. And I always forget that it's called Devil's Club in English, because when talking about them in English, I talk about them as river dragons. I think it's a more respectful name. They always remind me of brontosauruses that have been interrupted sleepily mid-munch. Um, but the one of the gifts that they share is that if you make a tincture or a tea out of the wood, someone who is losing weight and can't control it, which is often the symptom that does someone in while an herbal practitioner is trying to figure out what the underlying cause is. If you make a tea of the wood before meals, just a small shot glass, then eating the meal will stay on your body better, and can often be a life-saving first aid for folks who are undergoing wasting away conditions. And so I'd like to have that mentioned in the context of not just advocating for that gift being received, but also for helping transition the quote unquote Devil's Club community through the fact that it grows here in conditions that are going to become more scarce as things get hotter and drier.
Mm-hmm.
And so in proportion to receiving that gift, providing for that plant relatives community to be capable of giving it at all. But I don't know if that fits into your understandings as you've explored it, but is something very valuable to the community that my own aunties have said to try and get out there to folks, because that can often be something very dangerous to be experienced.
Yeah, so there's something interesting about that, which is that there's an herbal formula that has in this Chinese text that I work with called the Shanghanlun. There's an herbal formula that has that same quality that can be used in a similar manner. And it's not well understood that that also is formulated around one of the basic formulas that incorporates the cinnamon as its lead herb. And that so that's another sort of similarity that I think is really telling. It's about bringing that into into the body. So there's so many amazing connections that can bring those connections to light and illuminate them. And I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you so much.
I had a quick question about. I was really intrigued by the breath cycle and that chart that you were showing, and it reminded me of the circular hero's journey that is often kind of like mapped out in stories in the Western canon. And I'm curious if like this sort of key cycle of breathing in and out and all that, it like pops up in Chinese storytelling as like a framework for that, passing on stories and stuff like that.
Well, so I don't know if you're familiar with this book called The Origins of the World's Mythologies, but what we term the West does have a direct connection to this kind of larger Eurasian narrative structure. And so within that narrative structure, yes, you would find similarity. Personally, I'm trying to excise my any reliance on the hero's journey in favor of which seems a little DIY, and into a more DIT, as we heard last night, a little more DIT, like let's take that square center in the earth and see how that center of community and embodiment actually comes out to encompass the circle. So that in actuality, you can take that square of bonds and relationality and community and connection. And you can look through that and see the whole circle through it. Just as you can take the point of the emergence from the void of the water, and you can, and being itself as a raw being, and you can extract that, and then you can look at that whole thing through that as well. So yeah, it's definitely there, and you can see that within that cycle. And more, I would say.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions?
I do, but I need a second to formulate.
Okay.
There's all my
Question from
questions.
Dana.
Oh, there's a question from Dana.
Yeah, there is.
What is your view on spagyrics? I don't know what that word is.
Oh. Spagyrics.
Spagyrics. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's fascinating in the sense that it's a really amazing. Spagyrics is an amazing delivery model insofar as it has alchemical qualities as a part of it, and then also incorporates the physicality. And it's really, that's like a really significant part of it for me, is that it incorporates the physicality of substance. So I think that's really important.
Cool. Thank you. All right, Bobby.
Hi. Yeah, I just think this whole conversation is awesome because I don't know much about Chinese medicine, but in my own healing journey, I've leaned heavily on the sister sciences of yoga and Ayurveda.
Mm.
And in that process, as well as learning as much as I can about our native medicines and medicine ways here, but a lot of that is dormant. A lot of our healing ways with plants here. There's a lot of knowledge still alive, but or still awake rather. But always kind of pondering on how do they relate with one another? Like how can we take those practices and kind of merge them by, instead of, like you said, exporting medicines from across the globe, working with medicines here that do a similar thing. So I think that's just really amazing to hear the work you're doing, and I commend you on that. And then I also wonder, just like with the basket weaving and all that, becoming the predators of the invasive species, to put some pressure on them and to open the space for the native plants to be able to repopulate. Because I know, like
Right.
OSHA, we call house is we only have a few spots where we go dig it at, and I'm pretty I'm always pretty kind of like a share, but always this is very vulnerable, and some of these roots are older than some of these towns here.
Mhm.
And but so have you started to also do this with some of the common quote unquote invasive species?
Well, so there's an awesome book which I have right here, called Invasive Plant Medicine. And it so happens that many of those invasive plants are Chinese herbal medicine already.
Yeah.
And there's, so amongst them, the Japanese knotweed, and definitely kudzu has an extremely long history. Kudzu is in the text that I was describing, the Shanghan Lun, the text on cold damage, includes it. The second formula that's mentioned in that book includes kudzu.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, there's a lot of ways that this kind of like framework can facilitate that knowledge that can alleviate the pressure on the native plants.
Yeah.
And like that's part of what I'm saying is it's a question of how do we express our agency in tending that land?
Yeah.
And how can this inform our agency in attending to the land itself? in spite of the fact that its theoretical model is thousands of years and thousands of miles away, that when we come into its experience in our body, and we're experiencing our bodies in this land, in this space, that we allow that to move through us in a way that is in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so cool because I think about these things all the time. I manage a piece of land, a restoration project, and community always, what are you going to do about the weeds? And so many of them are medicine, and I just always think how cool it'd be to have people out there gathering those things for medicine. And then another cool thing was that I've been nerding out on dog bane hemp for years, but real heavily these last few months. And I can't remember the exact where I found it, but there was a Chinese medicine study on our native hemp here, and how just by wearing it on your skin can balance so many different, rheumatism and heart conditions, and which if you take the sap internally could stop your heart. So it's kind of interesting how that, and how it prevents eczema and psoriasis and things like that. So it's awesome.
Yeah, and like in the Chinese, earliest Chinese model, the word for poison and the word for potency are the same word. And so it's a question of appropriateness.
Yeah.
Always. And that's called appropriateness. Another way to put that is called, in Chinese, is called de, which gets translated as virtue, but it really means seeing things in the right way and then following that in a straight path. So that's what virtue is.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate everything, all your work and your sharing is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, it's 3:32. We have one more question. Is that all right?
All right. Oh, you kind of spoke to it already with that last question. I appreciated, but just kind of wanting to explore that conversation of how the land and place informs the lens or framework from which we're coming from when honoring and becoming in right relationship with plant spirit. And just you kind of mentioned that already, but just kind of thinking about does the energy of the medicine, I would say it would, but just kind of exploring the energy of the medicine within the relationship that we have with the plants change depending on the framework we're coming from. And just kind of thinking about how place would inform which framework we should come from when interacting with certain plant spirits. Because I think it can be easy, for certain frameworks to get applied to a place and then perpetuate ignorance of what is actually appropriate for that space. So you kind of touched on that, but just wanting to expand on that a little bit.
I realized it was super abstract in the beginning where I'm talking about time, but it's all time. And so time is the most essential thing, and the timing of things, it's literally how everything moves through us is an expression of time, and time is not within us, it's beyond us, and it moves through us. And so cultivating a quality of stillness and that allows clarity to sprout and emerge so that we can perceive those wisps of the expression of time directly, means that then we simply follow them, and that we recognize that those literally, they don't metaphorically come from the land, they literally come from the land. They're coming up through and with and around us, and we can cultivate the capacity to perceive them. And then we maintain community and appropriateness and relationship so that we can vet those things against that. And that's also true with the lore as well. And in Chinese medicine, that means also with the text, and that means also with lineage. That we have a direct lineage that's not just some kind of random Prussian style educational system, but a direct heart-to-heart connection that we've had with an individual and that individual and that individual and that individual. and that those are historical individuals and not some orientalized fantasy of what those people are. And so it's really quite similar. And again, like I have to say, like I'm immersed in that aspect of things, but I can't say that about this yet, you know, and I'm trying to establish that in a proper way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandt.
Thanks. It's an honor, really, and I appreciate it.
The honor is ours.
This
as
is
well.
fascinating. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you for coming to this session. Our next one starts at 4 o'clock. And yeah, I'll leave the window open for a few minutes if people want to look at the comments and stuff. But again, I will upload the comments to the whatever the what is it called? Hoova. There we go. Yeah, we'll see you at 4 o'clock. Thank you.